Mr. Vice Chancellor, honored guests, and members of the New College community, a warm welcome to this opening lecture of the University of Edinburgh School of Divinity for the academic session 2010 to 2011. I'm Stuart Brown. I'm Professor of Ecclesiastical History and head of the School of Divinity. Now, some newcomers to our university may have noticed the crowds in the streets. The parade, the brass bands, the helicopters flying overhead, the Pope's presence, and may wonder, is there always such fanfare for the New College opening lecture? Well, of course not, because this is a special occasion. For today we have both the New College opening lecture and the inaugural lecture of a recently appointed professor, hence the fanfare. And I understand that the Queen and the Pope have had to give their apologies for the opening lecture. They simply couldn't get through the crowds, which is a shame as they've traveled so far. In a moment, I will invite the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh to introduce and chair our inaugural lecture. But first, a word about the opening lecture of New College. The New College opening lecture is a tradition going back to 1850, and the opening of these buildings, which were then the Theological College of the Free Church of Scotland. The Free Church had been formed in 1843 at the great disruption of the National Church of Scotland, when about half the membership had left the National Church over what they perceived as challenges to the independent spiritual witness of the Church. And they formed a new national church, and through considerable sacrifice during the 1840s, the worst depression of the 19th century, they built hundreds of new churches, schools, manses, and they also constructed these buildings as a great free college on the Mound. And at the opening of these impressive buildings in 1850, each of the 6 professors was asked to give a public lecture, introducing his discipline, his scholarly approaches, and some of his big ideas. They were held on consecutive evenings to large Edinburgh audiences, and these opening lectures were such a vibrant occasion that they were repeated. And every year since 1850, a member of the New College teaching staff opens the academic session with a public lecture. It's a great tradition, and it continued after 1935, when New College became the Divinity School of the University of Edinburgh. It marks a new beginning, and it's also a time of homecoming and memories for many of our alumni who are with us today. Finally, could I extend a special welcome to all our international students. Many of you have traveled long distances. You've made major sacrifices to be with us today. We're very pleased to have you with us, and we hope that you have a fulfilling experience at the university and in this beautiful city of Edinburgh. Mr. Vice Chancellor, it is now my honor to invite you to chair the inaugural lecture of Professor Stanley.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. Tremendous pleasure to be chairing this lecture. Inaugural lectures are lovely. They're a bit like weddings. You know, they are public events. They are, you know, the strong association of the new professor with the institution. And like a wedding, you expect the family to be there. So I'm really pleased to particularly welcome Professor Stanley's wife, Rosemary, his elder daughter, Rebecca, his parents, in-law, Mr. and Mr. Alan Vaughan, and his brother-in-law, John Levick. You're very welcome. Other people who are, as it were, part of the lay audience, you are particularly welcome. Really pleased that we have special guests from Cambridge, from Surrey, Durham, North Queensferry, Stirling, York, Livingston, and obviously, as Professor Brown mentioned, we also have new students with us from every part of the world. So a really warm welcome to you. Professor Stanley studied history at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and that was the point at where his academic interest developed. He was just telling me that it was studying the combination of African history and modern religious history at the same time under the direction of Owen Chadwick that really sparked off the interest, the academic interest he has, and in which he is now being tremendously successful. And for those of you who are not in the academic racket, it's very hard to get to be a professor. It's extremely competitive. It is a massive achievement to get a chair. It is particularly hard to get a professorship in this university. It's one of the world's greatest universities. It's highly competitive. So this is a massive achievement. And he started on the path to that massive achievement at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, continued there for his doctorate, which looked at the role of missionary enthusiasm in early Victorian religion and society. He then taught church history and mission studies at Spurgeon's College, London, Trinity College, Bristol, the Cambridge Theological Federation, and in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. From 1996 to 2001, he directed an international research project on the growth of Christianity as a world religion. And from 2001 to 2008, he was director of the Henry Martyn Centre for the Study of Mission and World Christianity. He was also a fellow of St Edmund's College. He took up his chair in Edinburgh in January 2009, and he also holds the role of Director of the School of Divinity's Centre for the Study of World Christianity. Obviously, this is an extremely important role. It is. I'm immensely proud of the great contribution the University of Edinburgh, through its School of Divinity, makes to the study and understanding of religion throughout the world, and Professor Stanley is critical for that. His research focuses on something which is particularly salient for this university, the modern Protestant missionary movement from the 18th century to the present day, and the complex ways in which its legacy has been appropriated within contemporary world Christianity. And you don't get the massive achievement of a chair without previous massive achievement in publications. He's written or edited 7 books, and with Dr. Sheridan Gilly, he was co-editor of Volume 8 of the Cambridge History of Christianity. And so he's someone who has made both the highly specialised contributions, but also made contributions that are important to a wide range of students and scholars. His major study of the World Missionary Conference, Edinburgh 1910, was the recipient of an award of merit from Christianity Today magazine in the United States, and he has recently been translated into Korean. With Professor Robert Frankenberg, he's co-editor of the widely acclaimed Erdmann series, Studies in the History of Christian Missions, which to date has published 17 titles. So in addition to publishing his own books, he's helping other people produce the highest quality publications. Today, he's going to address us on the topic Edinburgh and World Christianity. Please welcome Professor Stanley.
Principal, Professor Brown, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, may I first of all add my own thanks to all of you for coming today. As the Principal and Professor Brown have indicated, some of you have travelled quite a distance to be here. Others may not have come so far, but it may have seemed like a long journey in view of the transportation difficulties created by a certain rival religious attraction. So thank you very much for coming. I should like to just welcome certain friends in particular to add to what the Principal has already said. Professor and Mrs. David Thompson have travelled up from Cambridge. Professor Thompson is a long-standing friend of the School of Divinity. He was also my PhD supervisor, and for 6 years was my boss. He's been a guiding hand on my career ever since the mid-1970s. Also from Cambridge, we have Professor and Mrs. Bob White. Bob and I were undergraduates together at Emmanuel College. I owe to Bob my nomination on my return to Cambridge for election as a Fellow of St Edmund's College, which was a wonderfully congenial environment during my time in Cambridge from 1996 to 2008. We also welcome Professor and Mrs. David Bebbington from Stirling University. David was best man at my wedding, and his example of outstanding Christian scholarship has been a model throughout my career. We're delighted also to have with us the current president of the Ecclesiastical History Society, Dr. Sheridan Gilly. I think I saw, yes, he is with us, who, as you will have heard, was an invaluable co-editor with me of the 19th century volume in the Cambridge History of Christianity. Finally, I think I have to present apologies. I don't think he's here, from Professor Andrew Walls, founder of the centre which I have the great honour to direct, and of course the first holder of the Chair of World Christianity in this university. He sent his apologies for absence and very best wishes to us all, as he has to be on his way to Nairobi today. Most mornings I travel to Edinburgh on the train from my home in Fife, often in the company of the great-grandson of Hari Kambiwa Matacheta, one of the first two Malawians to be ordained to the Presbyterian ministry. 99 years ago, in 1911, Matacheta, along with Stephen Kundecha, was ordained to the presbyterate by Church of Scotland missionaries from the Blantyre mission. This afternoon, his great-grandson, Max Kalamula, is with us here in Edinburgh, in the city in which he works. It's amazing what can happen from a conversation on your morning train. There can be few, if any, cities in the United Kingdom, and very few even in Europe, which have such strong and multiple connections with the story of the growth of the Christian church in Africa and Asia over the last century or so. And in this lecture, I want to explore just a few of those connections, relating to three individuals whom I have selected for their actual or symbolic significance for the development of world Christianity. On first impression, this might appear to be an unfashionably Eurocentric, indeed Edina-centric approach to the modern history of world Christianity, as if the story could adequately be told in terms of a new and specifically Scottish history of the Acts of the Apostles, radiating outwards from the New Jerusalem of Edinburgh. However, I hasten to add that only one of the three individuals I have selected was a Scot. One was a Korean, and the other, with whom I begin, was a Xhosa from the deep south of Africa. The city, and to an extent the University of Edinburgh, feature prominently in the lives of these three people. But Edinburgh was not the sole or even the primary source of the respective contributions they made to the history of world Christianity. First of all, Tiyo Soga. On the 3rd of February 1857, at a service at Bristow Street United Presbyterian Church in Edinburgh, several missionaries were set apart for the work of the foreign mission field. What was unusual about this particular valedictory service was that one of those being commissioned was himself a black African. George Johnston, the minister who addressed the missionaries on that occasion, addressed Tiyo Soga, recently ordained as the first black South African to enter the Christian ministry, in the following terms: "You are going home to your fatherland and to the tents of your own people. You came amongst us as a stranger with your heart filled with love to God. You have studied in our college and in our hall in order to prepare yourself for the great and glorious work of the ministry. Now that you are about to return to your own land, to proclaim the unsearchable riches of Christ to your countrymen, I am sure that every heart in this assembly is beating with the deepest interest towards you, and sending up the earnest prayer in your behalf, that you may be the means of converting thousands of them to the faith of the gospel, that you may be honoured to be the founder of an enduring and prospering church in Cathwaria, and that generations yet unborn may arise and pronounce the name of Tiyo Soga with blessings on his head. Soga was, in the conventional parlance of the day, a Kaffir, a Xhosa from the troubled eastern frontier of the Cape Colony. The term Kaffir, and hence Cathwaria, was first affixed to the Bantu-speaking peoples by the Muslim traders of the Indian Ocean coast. Originally an Arabic word for the unbelievers, or literally the ungrateful, who did not know Allah, it had been transposed in the Southern African context into a term applied by both Boers and British to their so-called heathen neighbours. The term did not necessarily carry, at the time, the full weight of derogatory racist sentiment which it subsequently acquired, and Tiyo continued to use it of his own people throughout his life. Born in 1829, this believing inhabitant of the so-called land of the unbelievers owed his Christian faith to his parents, who were followers of the remarkable Xhosa prophet and hymn writer Itsikana. His father, Old Soga, was the first Xhosa to use a plough and to irrigate his crops. He, the father, was a polygamist and pursued his own variety of Christianity that never conformed to missionary expectations. Tiyo's mother, Nsutu, was, however, baptized by a missionary of the Glasgow Missionary Society and sent her sons to be educated at the Society's school at Chumi. In 1844, Tiyo was given a scholarship to the more advanced school or seminary which the Society opened at Lovedale in 1841. When Lovedale had to close in 1846, owing to the resumption of war between the Xhosa and the British, Soga was taken with his mother's blessing to Scotland by William Govan, the principal. There he was enrolled for a year in a school at Inchinnan in Renfrewshire, before being sent for teacher training at the Free Church of Scotland Normal School. He was baptized in John Street United Presbyterian Church in Glasgow on the 7th of May 1848. The baptismal sermon was appropriately on the Ethiopian eunuch. On his return to the Cape, Soga worked as an evangelist and catechist at Chumi. He came to Scotland for a second time in June 1851 to prepare for ordination, studying both at the University of Glasgow and from 1852 in the Synod Hall of the United Presbyterian Church at 5 Queen Street, Edinburgh, now the Jam House restaurant. He also married a Scottish wife, Janet Burnside. His ordination in John Street Church on the 23rd of December 1856 was memorable chiefly for the ordination prayer uttered by the same minister, William Anderson, who had baptized him 8 years earlier. Soga's biographer, John Aitken Chalmers, records the prayer as follows. The old man seemed wild with excitement. With one hand resting on the woolly head of Tiyo, whilst the other was outstretched to heaven, he screeched out one of the most extraordinary prayers that ever fell from human lips. With a pathos and earnestness never surpassed, he offered supplications for the richest blessings to rest on his young Kaffir brother. Then there was a sudden break to this thrilling devotion, and something followed very like a tirade against the colonial policy of England. The petitions seemed to bristle with scathing satire against Her Majesty's government and the Premier, and the colonial secretary's name rang throughout the church, whilst his blundering acts were confessed as if by his own lips. In marked contrast were the supplications presented for the noble Kaffir chieftain Sandili. Soga was being sent back as a missionary to his own people in a political context fraught by bitter conflicts over land between white settlers and Xhosa cattle rearers. The sympathies of Dr. Anderson, as of missionary opinion as a whole, were clearly with the Ongika paramount chief Sandili and not with the British colonial secretary, Lord Glenelg, who had until recently connived at the expulsion by the Cape government of Sandili's people from their lands west of the Kai River. The Tiyo Soga, the son of Sandili's councillor, Old Soga, the gospel he was being sent to proclaim could not be divorced from the issues of land rights that were beginning to tear Cape society apart. Neither could it be separated from the heritage of Itsikana, which combined Christian faith with adherence to Xhosa cultural traditions. As he reflected on these matters, Soga found inspiration from one of his professors in the Synod Hall, John Brown. Brown, it appears, was no longer at the height of his powers as a lecturer in exegetical theology, if the carefully chosen words of the historian of the Synod Hall are to be believed. Quote, shortly after the union of the Relief and the Secession Halls in 1847, the senior professor, Dr. John Brown, began to be assailed by the infirmities of an old age that had been prematurely superinduced through the severity of his continuous application to study. There was no weakening of his intellectual powers except in their elasticity. And elasticity never had been a prominent characteristic of any of his faculties, which was strong rather than nimble or subtle. Nevertheless, Soga's notebooks for September 1856, which sadly do not survive, include notes of a lecture by Brown on Romans 9, verse 3, a subject Chalmers observes, which Tiyo often afterwards took as a theme of discourse in addressing his countrymen. We don't have the text of Brown's Edinburgh lectures on Romans, but there is evidence that they formed the basis of his commentary on the epistle, published in the following year. What seems to have so impressed Soga were Brown's comments on Paul's statement that he would have been willing even to be accursed and cut off from Christ if by so doing he could have achieved the salvation of his brethren the Jews, his kinsmen by race. Christianity, observed Brown in his commentary, does not unhinge the relations formed by nature, it draws them closer. It does not extinguish the affections which grow out of those relations, it regulates and sanctifies them. Paul, when he became a Christian, became a cosmopolite, a citizen of the world, but he did not cease to be a Jew. He became a philanthropist, but he continued a patriot. Brown's lectures taught Soga that there was solid New Testament authority for the compatibility of the universal gospel of Christ with particular national or ethnic allegiances. Donovan Williams has argued that Soga was a Christian apostle of negritude, the first public spokesperson in southern Africa of black consciousness. In a private journal entry written in April 1865, which he later developed into an article in the King Williamstown Gazette on the 11th of May, Soga deployed biblical material to contest statements that John Aitken Chalmers, whom Soga counted as a friend, had made in the same newspaper, to the effect that the supposedly indolent and degenerate Kaffir race was destined for ultimate racial extinction before the onward march of white civilization. Soga argued that, on the contrary, according to the Bible, the only book whose predictions to me is law, Africa God has given to Ham and all his descendants, that nothing shall ever dispossess them of this inheritance, that God will keep the Kaffir in his southern portion of it, and that God will so overrule events as always to secure this. The prediction of Psalm 68, verse 31, that Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands to God, was, Soga insisted in his article, the sheet anchor of the Church of Christ, a guarantee that the gloomy forecasts of white racial theory would not come to pass. Soka also welcomed the appearance in 1862 of Indaba, the first Xhosa newspaper, which he saw as a crucial vehicle for the expression of Xhosa nationhood. Tiyo Soga stands as one of the earliest representatives of a theme that has attracted increasing attention from African historians. The biblical narrative of God's salvific dealings with a chosen yet wayward nation, redeeming Israel from Egyptian slavery, restoring her from exile in Babylon, has frequently become an inspiration and prototype for African intellectuals and politicians concerned to find theological legitimacy for the quest of colonized African peoples for freedom and selfhood. African nationalism, wrote the late Adrian Hastings, has hardly existed except where it has been ethnically based, linguistically held together, and biblically watered. The theory that the African race was the offspring of Ham, second son of Noah, was of course notoriously manipulated by white supremacists, both in southern Africa and in the US, to justify the subjugation of blacks, who were alleged to have inherited the patriarchal curse pronounced on Ham's son Canaan. But for Soga, as for some other African American theorists, the Hamitic theory was the basis not of curse, but of promised blessing for the African race. When yoked together with the Ethiopianism of Psalm 68 and Paul's unashamed affirmation of patriotism in Romans 9, it appeared to offer the Xhosa and black Africans as a whole the pledge that they had a unique role to play in the accompaniment of the divine purpose of salvation for all nations. Tiyo Soga showed his enduring affection for Scotland by sending his 4 sons to study at the universities of Glasgow or Edinburgh. His second son, John Henderson Soga, followed the arts course in the University of Edinburgh from 1886 to 1890, before proceeding, like his father, for ordination training at the United Presbyterian Synod Hall. He completed his father's translation of the Pilgrim's Progress into Xhosa and became not simply a missionary, but also the first historian of the Xhosa nation. Tiyo Soga himself died comparatively young in 1871. His memorial inscription, written by the same Dr. Anderson, who had baptized him and prayed so memorably at his ordination, described him, among other distinctions, as an ardent patriot and a model Kaffirian for the imitation and inspiration of his countrymen. Modern historians prefer to call him a precursor of Pan-Africanism, even of African nationalism. John Brown's lectures, delivered at 5 Queen Street, Edinburgh, inelastic though they may have been, played their part in grounding Soga's Xhosa patriotism and Pan-Africanism on a biblical foundation. Secondly, Yun Chi Ho. In modern Africa, Christianity has more often been the source or ally of national consciousness than its enemy, despite the protestations of much post-colonial rhetoric to the contrary. In Asia, the reverse has generally been the case for obvious reasons. In different parts of the Indian subcontinent, either Hinduism, Buddhism, or Islam has succeeded in imposing monopolistic claims on national identity, whilst in China, Christianity has borne the brunt of the anti-foreignism that has deep roots in Chinese history. But the great exception to this generalization is Korea, especially since the Korean War, South Korea, where Christian allegiance and national identity have reinforced each other to an extent that even few African nations can match. Our second figure linking Edinburgh to the story of world Christianity has played a profound, if ambiguous, role in this process. On or shortly before Monday the 13th of June 1910, an aristocrat could have been observed checking in to Edinburgh's premier hotel, the Balmoral, on Princes Street. The Balmoral was, and no doubt still is, accustomed to welcoming guests of noble birth. But what was unusual about this one was that he was Korean. The Honourable Yun Chi-ho had come to attend the historic World Missionary Conference held in this very assembly hall. He was the only Korean Christian to do so, and one of only 20 non-Western Christians among 1,215 official delegates. He was accompanied at the Balmoral by his American missionary minder, Bishop W.R. Lambuth, Secretary of the Board of Missions of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Yun owed his presence at Edinburgh to a personal invitation from the chairman of the conference, John R. Mott. "You are preeminently the man to represent your important and beloved country," Mott wrote. "In view of God's mighty work, it is most desirable that you be present at Edinburgh." Yun Chi-ho was born in 1865, the son of a Confucian aristocrat who later attained ministerial rank in the Korean government. He was also one of the earliest members of the pro-Japanese Reform Party. As a child of a noble family, Yun received a privileged literary education in the Confucian classics. As a teenager, he was sent to Japan to study the modernized governmental institutions established following the Meiji Restoration and became fluent in Japanese. For the remainder of his life, he was to be alternately fascinated and alarmed by Japan, fascinated by the example it set of how to transform a traditional Asian feudal society into a politically reformed and economically advanced modern state, but alarmed by the implicit threat that its newfound military might posed to its neighbour. Yun was appointed to a secretarial post in the Korean Foreign Office, but in 1885 suspected of involvement in an unsuccessful coup led by a group of radical reformers, he fled to China. In Shanghai, he enrolled as a student in the Methodist Episcopal institution, the Anglo-Chinese College, where in 1887 he became a Christian. Coming to the notice of the leading Methodist missionary, young J. Allen, he was sent to study in the United States, first at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, then at Emory College, later university, in Oxford, Georgia. He was, I think, the first Korean to study in the United States, and it was there that he attracted the attention of John Mott. He returned to Korea in 1895 to take up a series of government posts, rising to the position of acting Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1904 to 6. He resigned from government office in 1906 in protest at the imposition of a Japanese protectorate on Korea in November 1905. Now, many of the verdicts passed on the World Missionary Conference in this centenary year have observed that the conference took place towards the high point of Western imperial enthusiasm and have lamented that many of its pronouncements reflected that fact. What many modern Christian commentators fail to notice is that 1910 also marked a milestone in the emergence of a new Asian colonial power. Korea was fully annexed by Japan just 2 months after the Edinburgh Conference, on the 22nd of August and was to remain a Japanese colony for the rest of Yun's life until shortly after his death in 1945. The imperialism that preoccupied Yun Chi Ho during his stay in Edinburgh emanated not from the West, but from the East. The evidence we have from 1910 suggests that Yun was broadly supportive of the idea that Western nations had a divine commission to disseminate Christian civilization in Asia. He had drawn from young J. Allen the principle that spiritual renewal was the key to the strengthening of a nation, and his sojourn in the States had convinced him that the superiority of Western civilization could be attributed to the influence of Christianity. He had also imbibed from his time at Vanderbilt a Christianized form of social Darwinism. Confucianism was backward and degenerate, whereas Christian peoples had discovered the secret of national strength and were destined to rule the world. Yun made 3 public contributions to the Edinburgh Conference. The first was in the debate on the Commission 1 report on carrying the gospel to the non-Christian world. He referred to the rapid expansion of the Korean Protestant churches, growing in the space of 25 years to a membership of nearly 200,000 Christians. But he warned of the consequent danger of shallow doctrinal understanding, combined with the revival both of Buddhism and Confucianism, and the growing influence of Western materialist philosophies. We should remember that he had become a Christian before he arrived at a social Darwinist understanding of Korean nationalism. For Yun, Christianity was not simply a means to a nationalist end. He also spoke in the debate on the Commission 2 report on the church in the mission field, challenging the almost universally accepted principle that money contributed by Western Christians should be under their control, and urging that national leaders be taken fully into consultation in the allocation of funds. So his enthusiasm for Western civilization did not blind him to the dangers of foreign domination of a young church. Nevertheless, his third address, given to the Parallel Conference for Mission Support Workers, held at the Synod Hall, which by now was in Castle Terrace, combined an emphasis on the need for the native church to develop its own self-supporting ministry with an assertion that non-Christian nations were bound to be attracted to Great Britain and America as exemplars of the principle that Christianity was the foundation of the highest type of modern civilization. Yun made an impression at Edinburgh more by who he was, the most prominent Christian advocate of national reform and independence in Korea, than by what he said. It is more difficult to ascertain the impression that coming to the Edinburgh Conference made on him. He kept diaries which have been preserved, but sadly the diaries for the years from July 1906 to 1915 are missing. The reason they are missing is that in late 1911, Yun was imprisoned by the Japanese on suspicion of having conspired to assassinate the Japanese Governor-General of Korea, Taruchi Masataki. Of 124 persons so accused, 98 were Christians. Yun was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment in September 1912 and remained in prison until pardoned by the emperor in 1915. We may deduce that his diary for 1910 was among those confiscated and destroyed by the prison authorities. We do, however, have a diary entry from much later in Yun's life from 1940, which at first sight throws into question the extent of his enthusiasm for the Western imperialism evident at Edinburgh in 1910. In 1910, he says, I went to Edinburgh to attend the World Missionary Conference. A Dr. White at a luncheon given in a large auditorium to the delegates representing a score of nations wasted nearly an hour in eulogizing the achievements of the Anglo-Saxon nations, England and America. It was very ungentlemanly on the part of the old fellow to indulge in such vulgar jingoism. Hitler will have done one good thing in the world if he succeeds in punching a big hole in the arrogance balloon of the Anglo-Saxon pride of the coarse Kipling type. Now, this distant recollection of the then principal of New College should, however, be treated with caution, certainly as evidence of Yun's own views in 1910. The large auditorium was in fact the Rainy Hall. The occasion was a dinner given by the senatus of New College to 100 representative conference delegates. And despite Alexander White's after-dinner speech, Yun evidently communicated a high esteem for Edinburgh to his family. For his first cousin, once removed, Yun Bo-sun, entered the University of Edinburgh in 1925, graduated MA with an Igretat degree in 1930, and from 1960 to 1962 was the fourth president of the Republic of South Korea. Yun Chi-ho himself withdrew from politics after his release from prison and devoted himself to educational and YMCA work. By the late 1930s, he had reversed his previous antipathy to Japanese rule. He had come to the prudential view that assimilation into the Empire of Japan, as manifestly the fittest nation to emerge from the struggle for supremacy in East Asia, offered the best hope for the advance of Korea to a position of national strength that would rival the Western powers. Without abandoning his Christian faith, he now believed that Korea should be a Scotland of Japan and never, no, never an Ireland of Japan. Looking back at the 1910 conference, from this new political vantage point, he now regarded its Anglo-Saxon Christian imperialism with less favour than once he did. His eventual conviction that the manifest destiny of the Korean nation lay in the hands of Japanese imperialism rather than Western imperialism has left a lasting blot on his reputation in Korea. Nevertheless, the patriotic hymn, the Aigukka, almost certainly composed by Yun in 1896, was in 1937 adopted by the Provisional Government of Korea in exile in Shanghai as the Korean national anthem. Combining Confucian patriotism with some Christian motifs, it became the national anthem of the Republic of Korea in 1948 and survived partition as the national anthem of South Korea, although it was no longer sung to the tune of Auld Lang Syne, as it had been by Korean exiles throughout the Japanese colonial period. Now, our instinctive responses to the respective amalgams of Christianity and nationalism, represented by Tiyo Soga and Yun Chi-ho, are ambiguous and perhaps inconsistent. We're inclined to give a favourable verdict on African nationalism because it was generally anti-colonial, although Soga's was not, often broadly Christian in inspiration, and because we can identify it with widely acclaimed leaders such as Nelson Mandela. We are less sure about Korean Protestant nationalism, perhaps because it reminds us uncomfortably of our own dubious forms of Christian nationalism in Europe or the United States. Contemporary Korean Protestantism retains much of the distinctive synthesis that Yun Chi-ho himself displayed, of a compelling sense of Christian world mission, an exaggerated reverence for certain aspects of the Western cultural inheritance, and a deep indebtedness to other religious or cultural motifs of indigenous origin. Thirdly, John Alexander Dowie. Our third and final figure is a Scot, born in Edinburgh, though he did not spend much of his life there. John Alexander Dowie was born in Edinburgh on the 25th of May, 1847, but at the age of 13, his family emigrated to Adelaide, following in the footsteps of his uncle Alexander. Sensing a call of God to Christian ministry, Dowie left Australia in 1869 to enter the University of Edinburgh, where he studied literary and philosophical subjects in the Faculty of Arts, though he never took his degree. It is also recorded that he took voluntary theological courses in the Free Church School, which must mean New College. His academic career was undistinguished, but we do know that he served as an unofficial chaplain in the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, which entitled him to attend lectures in medicine, including some by the celebrated Sir James Young Simpson, and also to observe operations, surgical procedures which in the early 1870s frequently had fatal consequences. As he heard professors admit that they were only guessing in the dark in their diagnoses, Dowie imbibed a skepticism towards the medical profession that remained with him for the rest of his life. On his return to Australia, Dowie was ordained into the congregational ministry on the 21st of April 1872 and was called to the pastorate of a church at Alma near Adelaide. He also married his cousin, Jane, daughter of his uncle Alexander. The Alma ministry and 2 subsequent congregational pastorates in Sydney proved short-lived, but in the course of these early pastorates, Dowie discovered a dimension of Christian ministry for which New College had not quite prepared him. In the course of an epidemic that was devastating Sydney in 1874, Dowie was called to the bedside of a dying girl and was led to pray for her immediate healing. She was healed, after which not one more person in his congregation died from the epidemic. Dowie became convinced that all disease was the foul offspring of its father Satan and its mother sin, and that the atoning work of Christ included deliverance from sickness as the work of the devil. From late 1877, he ministered in a series of independent chapels or tabernacles in Sydney and Melbourne, where in 1882 he founded the International Divine Healing Association. He established contacts with holiness teachers in Britain and North America who were developing a similar interest in divine healing. In March 1888, with his wife and 2 children, he left Melbourne for California. His original intention was to attend a convention on divine healing in England. But the healing services which he conducted up and down the Pacific coast, once he got to California, were so well received that he decided to stay on in America. In 1889, he began publication of a newspaper, Leaves of Healing, which first appeared in Australia, and then in the summer of 1890, he settled in Evanston, Illinois. Dowie persuaded himself that the morally notorious metropolis of Chicago should be the centre of his future ministry. And in 1893, he erected a wooden tabernacle just across the street from the entrance to the World's Columbian Exposition, or the World's Fair. His healing miracles began to draw the crowds. A wall of the tabernacle was adorned with discarded crutches and leg braces, described as trophies captured from the enemy, and displayed in the shape of a crown under the motto, "Christ is all." His congregation soon outgrew the tabernacle, and for a time he leased the Chicago Auditorium, which he filled with crowds of over 4,000, before taking over a disused Episcopal church on Michigan Avenue for his services. In February 1896, he formed the Christian Catholic Church in an endeavour to replicate the apostolic pattern of the New Testament church. Dowie was becoming a Chicago celebrity of some notoriety. In the Leaves of Healing for the 30th of September 1899, he declared a 3 months holy war against the hosts of hell in Chicago. Prominent among the hosts of hell were the liquor and tobacco interests, which he attacked as he had in Australia with all the passion of a social gospeller. He was also vehement in his condemnation of racism, notably of the lynchings of African Americans. Less typically of the social gospel, the hosts of hell also included the medical profession. When Dowie announced that he was to lecture on the topic Doctors, Drugs and Devils, 2,000 medical students organised themselves to disrupt the meeting. Perhaps not ranked among the hosts of hell, but sadly not clearly identified with the hosts of Zion in Dowie's view, were the historic denominations. It was time he declared that the Baptists, founders of the University of Chicago, were utterly smashed. The Congregationalists he dismissed as living on the Pilgrim Fathers' dust, the brains of a dead theology. And as for the Presbyterians, if there is a miserable people on God's almighty earth, it is you. The Holy War came to a sudden end on New Year's Eve, 1899, when Dowie announced to his congregation that he had purchased a 6,500-acre site in Lake County on the shores of Lake Michigan for the construction of Zion City. He had abandoned the attempt to make godless Chicago conform to the values of the kingdom. He now sought to erect a theocratic polity ruled by himself as general overseer, in which there would be no breweries or saloons, gambling hells, houses of ill fame, hog raising, selling, handling, drug or tobacco shops, no hospitals or doctors' offices, theatres or dance halls, secret lodges or apostate churches, bad books, pictures or papers, or any of the curses or abominations which defile the spirits, souls and bodies of men. Dowie purchased the site on an 1,100-year lease, 100 years in which to found other Zion cities and prepare the way for the return of Christ, which was anticipated before the year 2000, followed by 1,000 years for the millennial reign of Christ on earth. Despite such apparent otherworldliness, the city was to be economically self-supporting, principally by means of a lace factory. Samuel Stevenson, a sympathetic lace manufacturer from Beeston in Nottinghamshire, and a labour force of English lace workers were recruited to run it. Godliness is profitable was one of Dowie's favourite mottos. There was tremendous public interest in purchasing plots in Zion City, and the godly lace factory did indeed make a profit. In fact, lace production continued until the 1950s. The avenues of the new city were given biblical names, such as Antioch or Elijah, but with two exceptions, Caledonia and Edina. The streets of the New Jerusalem thus retained echoes of Scotland and its capital. On the 2nd of June, 1901, a month before the official opening of Zion City, Dowie declared himself to be the messenger of the covenant, the prophet of whom Moses spoke in Deuteronomy 18, and Elijah the restorer, with a divine commission to restore the primitive Christian Catholic Apostolic Church. In September 1904, he went further still, donning resplendent high priestly robes, proclaiming himself the first apostle of the Lord Jesus for Christ in the Christian Catholic Apostolic Church in Zion, who is also Elijah, the prophet of the restoration of all things. Like many self-appointed charismatic leaders before and after him, Dowie's self-investment with theocratic power went to his head, and both the spiritual and economic health of the New Jerusalem deteriorated rapidly from now onwards. In 1906, he was deposed by his own lieutenants. He died in the following year, a broken man. You may well be asking by now why I have selected such an eccentric Scottish export to Illinois for inclusion in a lecture on world Christianity, given that by world Christianity we generally mean Christianity outside of Europe and North America. The answer lies in the influence which these strange events on the shores of Lake Michigan exerted on the continent of Africa. Zion City was intended from the first to be a missionary light to all nations. Leaves of Healing was circulated internationally, and a missionary organization known originally as the 70s was created to spread the message of Zion to other American cities and overseas. Bishop Bengt Sinclair, after conducting his pioneering research among the Zionist churches among Zulus and Swazis in the 1950s and 1960s, reported that when asked about the originator of their movement, Zionist leaders characteristically gave the answer, John Alexander, first apostle. The principal connection lies through the Dutch Reformed missionary Petrus Leroux, a disciple of another remarkable Scot and advocate of divine healing, Andrew Murray. In 1897, Leroux was introduced to Leaves of Healing by a Swiss missionary, Johannes Buchler, who was in contact with Dowie and responsible for inviting one of Dowie's missionaries, Daniel Bryant, to Johannesburg. Leroux was persuaded by what he read and heard from Bryant and began teaching his Zulu congregation at Wakkerstroom in the Eastern Transvaal that Jesus wants to be our Inyanga, our traditional healer, to heal us when we are sick in body. In 1903, he resigned from the Dutch Reformed Church to form his own church, the first black Zionist congregation on the African continent. Leroux may also be seen as the progenitor of South African Pentecostalism. In July 1908, he attended meetings in Doornfontein conducted by John G. Lake, one of Dowie's elders from Zion City, who had entered into a full Pentecostal experience of the Holy Spirit through influence from the Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles. Leroux was persuaded of the new Pentecostal teaching and became first president of the Apostolic Faith Mission, formed in 1908 as the first Pentecostal organization in South Africa. There was a progressive parting of the ways on racial lines between the predominantly white Apostolic Faith Mission and the black Zionist movement. The former pioneered white Pentecostal congregations in South Africa and after 1916 in what is now Zimbabwe. The latter developed over the coming decades into the most influential expression of Christianity among the South African black population. The ripples emanating from Zion City extended not just to Southern Africa, but to West Africa as well. Here the influence was less direct, but nonetheless identifiable. In late 1896, a former Methodist minister who had joined Zion City, Abraham Wilhild, established his own divine healing church in Philadelphia. In June 1898, this church formally affiliated to Dowie's Christian Catholic Church. The link was broken after the collapse of Dowie's reign over Zion City in 1906, but many of the Philadelphia church's members joined forces with another healing fellowship known since 1904 as Faith Tabernacle, founded by another admirer of Dowie, John Wesley Ankins, a former Baptist minister. Faith Tabernacle issued its own magazine, Sword of the Spirit, and from 1908 sent out its own missionaries. Within a decade, the Sword of the Spirit had reached missionary and African readers in Nigeria and Ghana. Branches of Faith Tabernacle sprang up in both countries. The appeal of a new church that proclaimed Christ's continuing power to heal all the sick in answer to prayer was reinforced by the disastrous influenza epidemic of 1918 to 19, which killed an estimated 500,000 Nigerians and 100,000 Ghanaians. Among those who read Sword of the Spirit were two Yoruba Anglican laymen, J.B. Sadari and David Ogunleyi Odubanjo. Odubanjo planted the first tabernacle congregation in Nigeria on Lagos Island, and in December 1923, Sadari and some 60 of his followers joined the congregation. In the same year, a second congregation was established in the Lagos suburb of Ebute Metta, from which clerks and traders spread Faith Tabernacle teaching by means of the new Nigeria Railway right up into northern Nigeria. In 1929, Joseph Babalola, another Anglican from northern Nigeria, joined the Ebute Metta congregation. He was to become the key leader in a massive healing revival that swept through Yorubaland in 1930 to 31. Nigeria, in addition to the Christ Apostolic Church, the Apostolic Church, and the Assemblies of God, both owe their origins to Faith Tabernacle. A similar story can be told from Ghana, where there were, by the end of the 1920s, at least 135 branches of Faith Tabernacle with up to 4,000 adherents. The Apostolic Church in Ghana and two African Pentecostal churches that seceded from it, the Christ Apostolic Church and the Church of Pentecost, all owe their origins to Faith Tabernacle leaders. It is estimated that in Nigeria and Ghana together, the churches that trace their history to Faith Tabernacle today have an aggregate membership of between 8 and 15 million. In Ghana, however, some of the earliest occurrences of Pentecostalism can be traced to the contacts of Thomas Brem Wilson, a member of the Gold Coast emigre population in London, who owed his initial conviction of the transforming power of the Holy Spirit to participation in the Euston Road branch of Dowie's Christian Catholic Church. And Brem Wilson visited Zion City in 1904. In conclusion, Tiyo Soga, Yun Chi Ho, and John Alexander Dowie represent divergent trajectories of development in the story of world Christianity over the last 150 years, though in each case, part of that trajectory passes through the city of Edinburgh. Tiyo Soga is emblematic of a powerful tradition in modern African Christianity that has found in the pages of Christian scripture validation of a sense of the God-given dignity and spiritual significance of black people. Whilst he himself supported British colonial rule as a vehicle of civilization among his people, his example inspired later generations to combat colonial exploitation in the name of the values that he found in the Bible. If the scandal of white domination in southern Africa is inexplicable without the ambiguous role played by the churches, it is also happily the case that the story of opposition to apartheid in South Africa and settler domination in Rhodesia cannot be told without making reference to the tradition of African Christian patriotism of which Soga was one of the chief architects. Yun Chi Ho also saw no incompatibility between Christian faith and the defense of nationhood. In his case, however, his opposition to Japanese suppression of Korean national aspirations depended, I think, less obviously on his reading of Scripture and derived instead from a synthesis between Christian allegiance and Darwinian notions of national struggle and superiority. Perhaps that was why he found it difficult to maintain a consistent attitude to Japanese control of the Korean Peninsula. Nevertheless, he reminds us that issues of how Christians should respond to the restless imperial ambitions of nations, whether those nations be Western or Eastern, are and will remain a constant theme of church history, and they are in no way restricted to the challenges posed by the Western colonial dominance of the 19th and 20th centuries. Dowie stands in marked contrast to the other two, for he eventually abandoned the quest to bring American national life into harmony with the kingdom of God, and sought instead to anticipate the coming kingdom through the construction of a visible terrestrial New Jerusalem. His theological edifice may appear to us the shakiest of this trio. Yet the reality is that he is the one who has left the greatest imprint on the face of world Christianity today. He can be criticized for collapsing the biblical tension between the already and the not yet. But he remained absolutely consistent in a country divided by racial antagonism to the principle that in the city of God there can be no distinction between black and white. Above all, for millions of Christians in the Southern Hemisphere today, his insistence that the salvation that Jesus came to impart is for the body as well as for the soul, and for this life as well as the life to come, is at the very heart of their faith. Thank you very much.
So tremendous pleasure to have the privilege to give a vote of thanks after such a wonderful and fascinating lecture. One of the things that one hears in really good inaugurals, and one heard it here, is the careful acknowledgement of debt to others. And Professor Stanley was exemplary when he was talking about his formative time in Cambridge. It was wonderful to hear about three such amazingly different iconic individuals. I thought the photographs were great, really nice. I was fascinated by Tiyo Soga and the story, which I guess of the three was the most, for me, the most familiar story, and the defense of African dignity. There was the second figure, Yon Chiao, and the interaction between Christianity and nationalism. I was very, very interested in that, and that for me had very interesting echoes of the Pope gave a very good address before the Queen this morning, and he talked about, as part of his address, the Christian resistance to Nazism, United Kingdom's role in the Second World War, and Northern Ireland, in ways that were really quite explicit about the religious obligations that arise in different settings. So I found the concept, which is new to me, of Korean Protestant nationalism very, very interesting. And then Dowie and divine healing, well, that was there was a lot of good knockabout fun there, some very good jokes. I would, particularly in this city, I would love to be able to go to a lecture on doctors, drugs and devils. It also makes me very cautious, because one of the things I do when I graduate with thousands of students at the University of Edinburgh, I always say to them, you know, you're trained as a medic, or you've done this or that, but what might you do? And usually I use boring examples, like you start as a medic and then you go off and write about Sherlock Holmes, or you start as a vet and you go off and found Dunlop. Dowie is a bit further and more dramatic. I learned an awful lot. It was a great pleasure. And before we applaud Professor Stanley again, can I invite you all warmly there's a reception in the Rainey Hall where you can acknowledge Professor Stanley's wonderful inaugural. And the other thing, there's a very simple convention at the University of Edinburgh. People in red gowns, you may ask them any question on any intellectual matter. Obviously, you can focus on church history, but if you are puzzled about Hegel or you don't really understand the Higgs boson, anybody in one of these fine gowns will be able to respond. So do please join us for the reception, but before we do that, let's thank Professor Stanley again.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.